to YCR's Food for Thought series. For those of you who are seeing us for the first time, we are an advocacy group made by students and young professionals for students and young professionals who believe that Canada can have a strong future in resources, the economy, and the environment. Please connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at YC Resources if you want to learn more about what we do. Before I introduce our special guest for today, I will first introduce myself and my co-hosts. Hi, I'm Justice. I am a graduate of the University of Alberta. I went there for a Bachelor of Commerce and majored in finance, minored in economics. And I'll hand it over to Ryan to introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Ryan Fournier. I've been with YCR for about a year now. I'm finishing my 4th year in a double major in criminology and political science at the University of Ottawa. So that's about me. I'll send it over to Lily now.
Thank you. My name is Lily Peterson. So I actually took the journalism program at SAIT, and I've been with YCR for about 6 months now. I'm really excited for the talk today.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So today we are welcoming Dr. Jamie Stephen. Jamie is the Managing Director of TorchLight Bioresources, which is a decarbonization strategy and policy advisor for national, provincial, and municipal governments, First Nations, utilities, airlines, large industrial emitters, property developers, and investment funds. His projects range from the development of energy facilities to national strategies on how to meet net zero targets. He has 2 decades of experience in the bioenergy industry, working at the interface of energy, forestry, agriculture, and waste sectors. Dr. Stephen holds a PhD in forest product and energy economics and a master's in chemical and biological engineering from the University of British Columbia. After growing up in the prairies and spending over a decade in Ontario, he now resides with his wife and 3 daughters in Nova Scotia. Before I hand the floor over to Jamie, please know that attendees are encouraged to ask questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen, which we will address at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'll now share the spotlight with our guest, Jamie. So welcome, Jamie. We're very glad to have you here.
Well, and thank you for the invitation. I'll just bring up my screen here, my presentation. So as you mentioned, I have been working in the bioenergy sector for about 20 years now. It is one of those quite controversial sectors, if you want to call it that. But people are actually quite shocked to know that in most countries, bioenergy is actually by far the dominant source of renewable energy. So for instance, in the EU, 60% of renewable energy is bioenergy, and in most countries, Canada is actually one of the few exceptions in the world where bioenergy is not #1 because of our large hydropower resources. So today I'm going to talk about bioenergy and why it is necessary, and specifically bioenergy and bioheat and something called BECCS, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, why they are necessary for climate credibility, so climate action credibility in Canada. So we really come at this from 2 sides. One is on the mitigation side, so this is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and the other is the adaptation side, which is really a critical component that is not always talked about. So summary of the presentation: without bioenergy, there is no enhanced forest management, and there is no bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And I'll get into why those things are critical, but without them, there's no way that Canada can achieve its climate goals. So let's just start at where we are in terms of the facts. So Canada's 2019 GHG emissions, anthropogenic, that means man-made emissions, were about 738 million tons. That's basically the exact same as they were in 2005. So we haven't actually gone anywhere. We haven't actually reduced any emissions. Canada's committed to reducing emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030. That's equivalent of eliminating all fossil fuel stationary combustion in Canada by 2030. Every furnace, every boiler, every component that we use to generate energy from fossil fuels. To put the numbers in perspective compared to other countries, we're talking about over around 300 million tons that we have to reduce. Spain's total emissions for 47 million people are 275 million tons. The Nordic countries, northern region needs a lot of heat. 27 million people, you would need 2 of the Nordic regions just to meet Canada's 2030 targets. That's 8 years, right? Or less than 8 years now. At the same time as we have these very high anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, Canada's forests have shifted from a net sink to a net source. That means that instead of more carbon being stored in the forest each year, they've actually become a net source. So they're actually a major emitter in Canada, not the forestry sector, but the forests, and have become a major net source, as I say. It's also important to keep in mind that the annual turnover, so this is the growth and natural death of Canada's forest, is 5 times the size of Canada's anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So what that means is, because we've got this giant forest carbon cycle going on, tipping it in any which direction has significant impacts for the overall net performance of Canada when it comes to emissions. So looking at these emissions from Canada's forests, what we can see here, this graph shows Canada's forests, the emissions from Canada's forests in red, and the trend line compared to timber harvest. What you hear a lot in the media is that Canada's harvesting more wood is a major driver for our emissions, and this is just simply not true. Canada's timber harvest is actually down by 1/3 since 2004, and the primary reason for this is a dramatic decrease in newsprint production. So in 2000, Canada was #1 exporter of newsprint in the world, more exports than the next 10 countries combined. Well, that hasn't been a very good business to be in over the past 20 years. And so what that has led to is a significant reduction in harvest, but at the same time, the net greenhouse gas emissions from the forest have increased and have actually, if you look at the chart there, 2018, for example, over 250 million tons. That is more than oil and gas, and it is more than transportation, our second and third largest source of emissions. So when people think about the forest, they think, well, we're storing more and more carbon, but the reality is that over the past 2 decades, we've actually lost a significant amount of carbon stored in the forest. And the primary reason for that is disturbance. And this shows, and just by disturbance, I mean wildfires and insects. So this shows natural disturbance emissions and total emissions. And what you can see is they track pretty closely. And so really it's wildfires, disturbance, and our forest being subjected to a changing climate that is driving these emissions. Now, the challenge is, if we stay on this path, what you see here in the red is those emissions and a projection out into the future with the trend line. And there's been multiple studies that show that this is pretty accurate. And then in the black there, those are historical emissions, and the gray is if we were to meet our Paris commitment in 2030 and then net zero by 2050. What you can see is if we stay on that, if we go on that track to reduce our anthropogenic, our man-made emissions, but we don't do anything about forests, by 2030, there will be more emissions from our forests than all our anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions combined. And so the problem becomes one of, if we're trying to reduce emissions as a country, by 2050, we would still have higher per capita greenhouse gas emissions than Germany, China, or Poland today, and double those of the UK or France today. So there's no way to meet any climate commitments, and obviously the atmosphere doesn't care if it's biogenic CO2 or non-biogenic CO2 up there in the atmosphere, it's CO2. And so what that means is we need to do something about our forests. Otherwise, what is the purpose of going through the energy transition and all the disruption and costs associated with that if we're not going to address our largest source of emissions? This is an image from Natural Resources Canada. It shows we're seeing a tripling of number of large fires by the end of the century. And this shows the annual area burned. Again, a tripling in the last part of the century. So the trend is really not our friend. So what can we do? Well, really the answer here is to implement what we call climate smart forestry. So then there's 4 components that I like to focus on today. The first is active forest management. This is actually taking a more active role in how the forests are grown and managed. Solid wood products. So when you have a piece of wood, lumber, etc., chairs, houses, if you're in a wooden home, wood is about 50% carbon. So that's locking carbon away in a solid wood product and storing it there. And then bioheat, this is basically generating heat from wood. And finally, BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So solid wood products. So in solid, our society, and particularly obviously housing, is built around solid wood products. And the great thing about these is that we are locking away that carbon. A tree is an incredible thing. It takes CO2 out of the atmosphere and turns it into a solid product that we can use for a variety of purposes. And so, I live in a house that was built in 1865. This was trees that probably grew sometime during the 18th century, or started growing during the 18th century, and that carbon is still locked away. Just incredible, right? So, and this can be single family detached homes, but we can also do what's called mass timber and build, essentially skyscrapers out of wood. Now, Canada's solid wood products production, as you can see, typically it's been highly correlated with US housing market. But in general, what we can see is about a 30 to 30% of our timber harvest is become solid wood products. And this is pretty consistent for many countries. The reality is that there's about double the amount of material coming from a forest ecosystem, including the residues from the sawmills, etc., that doesn't become solid wood products. And so the question becomes one of what to do with that material. It's either residues from the sawmill, it's not going to become a product. Think about chips, bark, etc. And also in terms of there's many trees that are of low quality. They could be damaged, they could be beetle infested, they could be cracked. There could be a lot of different things where they're just not of sufficient quality to go to sawmill. And so we need to think about what are we going to do with these trees. What we cannot do is only harvest the saw logs, because that's called high grading, and it's the least sustainable forest practice out there. It's not even permitted on Crown land, because what you're doing if you only harvest the trees that can be turned into lumber is you're decreasing the genetic quality of the forest over time, which is why it's not permitted. So active forest management. So this is, if we are actually going to try to address climate change instead of just talking about it, we actually need to take responsibility for our forests. We have in Canada 9% of the world's forests, but we're only 2% of the world's, or less than 2% of the world's emissions, 0.5% of the population. So when we talk about our primary climate responsibility, it really comes down to forests. It's, Canada is disproportionately more responsible for forests than other countries. And so active forest management, and this is really about adapting our forests to a changing climate, actually means more harvest, not less. But the primary driver has to be, what is the carbon performance for the overall system? We're trying to store as much carbon as possible across the land base. And we're going to try to store as much carbon as possible in solid wood products, and then replace those with material that cannot become a solid wood product. We're going to try to replace fossil fuels. So when we go in and we do active forest management, we're trying to reduce wildfire risk. We're trying to reduce insect risk. And this means much more frequency of treatment. So instead of going in once every 80 to 100 years and harvesting, we're actually going in much more frequently. And this is essential for adapting our forests to a changing climate. Now, when we do this active forest management, it actually generates a huge volume of low-grade wood. A lot of this wood, if we're doing thinnings, if we're removing trees that are likely to burn, we're generating a lot of low-grade material that won't become solid wood products. And so we need to think about what are we going to do with that. Now, I really want to put this in, in comparison, Canada's climate performance to other, boreal forest countries. So a study was completed comparing Canada, the Nordic countries, Alaska, and Russia. basically the northern boreal forest countries. And it's shockingly, what it found was that Canada has 60 times the disturbance rate, that means wildfires, insects, per forested acre as the Nordics, right? At the same time, Sweden, for example, is harvesting 7 times the volume per forested acre as Canada. And Sweden's forests, unlike Canada's, which are a major net source of emissions, theirs are a net carbon sink. So each year, more and more and more carbon is being stored in the forest, across the land base. And so much so that the net increase in carbon storage by the forest is so large, it reduces Sweden's national greenhouse gas emissions by 70%. So the results are there. And on a per capita basis, Sweden is at 1.4 million or 1.4 tons per person. Canada is 17 times higher at 24 tons per person. So there is a way to live in northern country, to have a sustainable forest, to store more and more carbon in that forest, but it actually requires you to go in and do something about it. And this is what Canada is not doing currently. So this is Sweden's forests, gives you an idea. Canada, and to put those numbers in perspective, Canada has 3 times the commercial forest per capita as Sweden. So 3 times the potential. And because we're so far behind, we've got even a much larger potential to improve, right? If Canada managed and harvests its forests like Sweden, this is not going to happen overnight, but just to put the numbers in perspective, timber harvest in Canada would not be 140 million cubic meters. It'd be 940 million cubic meters. And that's 800 million cubic meters is about 800 million tons of CO2. And remember, Canada's total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are 730. So it really puts, the solutions in perspective. And really, this is all about making decisions on management, about storing more and more carbon across the land base. Now, as I mentioned, not all wood can be a solid wood product, and generally we have twice as much material. And so historically, all those residues, those lower grade trees, they went to produce pulp and paper. And this gives you an idea of where we are in Canada with pulp and paper production. And actually, newsprint is now 2022 is down by over 80%. Interestingly, actually, a lot of the decarbonization that has occurred in the electrical system in Canada, namely Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, for example, has been possible because of closure of newsprint and mechanical pulp mills. So, for example, in Ontario, they were able to close down the coal-fired power plants because in 2005, coal was 19% of the electricity mix, but by the time they closed the plants, demand had dropped by 13 to 14% in the province. And the primary driver for reduced electrical demand was reduction in newsprint production. There was 15 pulp and paper mills in Ontario in 2005, and now there are 5. So it gives you an idea of what has actually been made the decarbonization of our electrical system possible, and it's through industrial closures. Now, what are we going to, if we don't have pulp and paper to consume that low grade material that can't become a solid wood product, what are we going to do? Well, the place where biomass can compete with other renewables is in heat. And so in Canada, almost 2/3 of energy consumption is in the form of heat. We spend all our time talking about electricity, wind and solar, etc. There's actually 5 times as much energy generated by biomass in Canada as wind and solar combined. But electricity is only 16% of our energy consumption, and it's only 12% of our, only 12% of our energy demand actually requires electricity. And so really, when we talk about decarbonization in Canada, it's about heat. And that is largely industrial heat, which you see is that dark red pie piece, and then heating buildings, right? We consume more energy for heating buildings than all the electrical demands in all of Canada, right? And if you think about what we already have on an electricity basis, all the giant hydro dams, all the nuclear power plants, all the fossil fuel plants, Obviously wind and solar contributes to that. It is still a tiny proportion of our actual energy demand. So, but the experience from other jurisdictions is already there. As I mentioned in the beginning, 60% of renewable energy in the EU is bioenergy, and most of that big red pie piece, that's solid biomass for heat, right? So within this graph, all the red is heat, the blue is electricity, and the yellow is transportation. Now, what do we mean by bioheat? So it goes from very small scale individual homes all the way up to heating entire cities and industry and industrial plants. So just on the upper left here, what you see is a wood pellet boiler. This is a central appliance. This is not a stove of any type. It's a central appliance. You control it with your thermostat, cell phone. You can go up and down, completely automated. Just like heating oil, you get maybe 2 bulk deliveries per year. The only thing a homeowner has to do is empty the ash bin once every 4 to 6 weeks. That's that little thing with the handle in the front there. So there's over 1.2 million of these boilers in Europe currently that have replaced oil in those areas that are typically more rural and not going to have access to network type energy sources. On the right here, these are similar types of pellet boilers or wood chip boilers. Some of them are flexible in terms of the fuel, and this is commercial institutional scale. So it gives the one in the right is a US college. There's about 500 of these in Canada, but there's about 60,000 in Europe. So we have a long way to go. But if, for instance, you're in Prince Edward Island, every school, hospital on the island is heated with wood chips. On the lower left here, this gives you an idea of what is actually possible. This is the Vertverkert plant in downtown Stockholm. Yes, Stockholm is heated with wood chips. This plant heats 190,000 residences. Obviously, co-generates electricity as well. Consumes about 1 million tons of wood chips per year, which is about what you would see for a quite a small pulp mill. And right now what they're doing is adding carbon capture and storage, which I'll get into, to this plant to make the city or to make the plant negative emissions. And that is critical to the city achieving its goal of becoming a net zero city before 2030. This is possible, and this is just one plant. Copenhagen has one, every town and city that you see in Nordic countries typically has a district heating system, which takes the heat from these central plants. It's a network of underground hot water pipes, and it supplies heat to those buildings. People don't have their individual furnace or boiler. And then what we see on the right here is an industrial biomass, or it's a biomass plant that provides process steam to a potato processing facility, right? So if you're an industrial heat consumer, these plants can be developed to meet those industrial heat loads and fuel switch away from natural gas or other fossil fuels. This is an example. This is Dow's largest facility in Brazil. There's a standalone biomass combined heat and power plant by this facility operating on eucalyptus, and it supplies Dow's chemicals facility with both electricity and with process steam. So finally, the kind of last point on those, what to do. This is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. This is basically a method of generating negative emissions, or what we call carbon dioxide removal, CDRs. And so, and unlike forest-based offsets, this is a permanent removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. So the tree is growing, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere as it grows, turning that into wood. We use that wood for energy generation, but instead of letting the CO2 go back up into the atmosphere where it came from, we take that CO2 and permanently put it underground. And so this is actually reversing climate change. It's reducing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, in the biosphere. And so this can be applied to any large biogenic CO2 resource, whether it's power plants or, for instance, pulp mills, for example. So when you talk about the storage potential, obviously we know the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin is really where the largest potential in Canada is. But fortunately, Alberta and Saskatchewan account for well over 50% of the industrial heat demand in Canada. And they also have the largest number of fossil fuel generating facilities, which present an opportunity for developing BECCS projects. Because you can fuel switch those former coal-fired power plants to biomass and then add carbon capture and storage, BECCS, to create negative emissions. So this is a list of Canada's coal-fired or former coal-fired, a lot of them have been converted to gas, generating stations. And what you can see is that in 2019, they generated about 43 million tons of CO2 emissions. If you switch them to biomass and operate at full capacity, they'd be almost 60 million tons of negative emissions of carbon dioxide removals. So the difference between where it was in 2019 and fuel switching and adding carbon capture and storage to these plants is 100 million tons of CO2. Right? Now, this is tongue-in-cheek, it's impossible, not going to happen. But the reality is, because of that reduction in namely our newsprint production, we actually have a huge amount of wood fiber available within our current existing annual allowable cut. This also excludes the harvest residues, so this is the tops and branches, and the non-merchantable timber, which we don't typically include, right, within those volumes. In terms of a CapEx, this is dramatically lower cost than pretty much every other decarbonization approach. Right? And it's also reflecting, creates an opportunity in terms of the number of jobs that we have lost in the forest sector and opportunities for Indigenous reconciliation as well, particularly in obviously forest management. But electricity is really just the start. As I mentioned, heat is really where the opportunity is, and that bioheat is really the prime alternative to fossil fuels in terms of particularly process heat and then heating buildings in a cold climate. So where's the first place to start? Well, the forest products industry is already a very large source of biogenic, stacked biogenic CO2 emissions. And so what this means is that we already have this resource, which is not a liability. It's not included in our energy facility GHG inventories because it's biogenic. It's already been counted when we harvested the tree in the forest. And so what that means is we can generate negative emissions from existing forest products facilities with a particular initial emphasis on Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so that's what we're doing. We're working in collaboration with West Fraser, which is the world's largest renewable materials company based out of Vancouver, and Vault 4401. This is a developer of subsurface CO2 storage projects. And so we're developing Rocky Mountain Carbon, which would be Canada's first BECCS project. We're currently conducting a FEED study, front-end engineering and design study. It's funded by Natural Resources Canada, Emissions Reduction Alberta, and obviously the project partners. And we've secured pore space, so this is the right to store that CO2 underground in Alberta. But we do need to have evaluation of those carbon dioxide removals. So in summary, and I do have a just kind of parting note after this, but in summary, we really need to think about Canada's forests when we talk about climate action. They're our largest climate liability, but they're also by far our largest climate opportunity. We have 9% of the world's forests, but we're only 2% of the world's anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, but we have 9% of the world's forests. And so we really need to re-envision what forests and forest management can do for Canada and for the world, quite frankly, particularly in a changing climate. Bioenergy must be viewed as both a climate mitigation and adaptation strategy, right, and our approach. We need the district energy system. So district energy is critical infrastructure for being able to distribute that heat, that energy generated from central heating plants. If you go to every other northern country, or most other northern countries, market penetration for district energy in the building heat sector is 55 to 95%. 55 to 95% of the population gets their heat that way. In Canada, it's less than 2%. So that's really our missing infrastructure for being able to consume this material. And then finally, net zero will not be reached without the negative side, without BECCS. And the Canada Energy Regulator has said this themselves. Okay. So parting note, this is the facility that I mentioned in Stockholm. Heats 190,000 homes or residences. It's 100% wood chips delivered by rail, marine. It's the heat generation from this one plant is double that of Canada's largest district heating system, which is Enwave in downtown Toronto, owned by Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. This one plant reduces emissions by 650,000 tons per year. When carbon capture and storage is added to it, it will be negative 800,000 tons per year in addition to that. So, very significant impact from a single facility. This is where it's located. It's, basically in downtown Stockholm. The stack is across the street from residential area. And what I would say about the emissions from this is per unit energy, it's actually lower air pollutants than natural gas furnaces, because you centralize the energy generation and you can include a lot of high performing flue gas treatment equipment. This is the pier that they built to be able to bring in chips, and train, rail receiving terminal as well. There's about 400 meters of underground conveyors to deliver the wood chips to the plant. And this kind of gives you a shot of that infrastructure that is there. I really want to emphasize, this is what is actually required to meet climate goals. It's not talking, it's not wind and solar, it's not a little heat pump there and here and there. This is large capital projects are required to meet climate goals, and countries like Sweden, Finland, and Denmark are really leading the way when it comes to decarbonization. This is just some more images. There's an underground bunker for chip storage. And again, really emphasize here that this plant, by creating a demand for low quality wood, allows the type of forest management that Sweden implements to be able to manage a forest to consistently be net carbon sinks instead of a source like Canada's. Also, obviously, creating a huge amount of rural jobs. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I know that a lot of this is quite new to people, and certainly not what we're currently being told as to what is required or the approach to decarbonization, but it is actually what has been successful.